A shy girl, quietly tidying a forgotten room, scribbled a note meant for no one in particular. She didn't know it would reach the heart of a CEO mourning the loss of his wife. Just a few lines, soft, unassuming, made a man who had been ready to give up choose to stay. Sometimes the thing that saves someone else comes from the pain you thought no one would ever see. And this is where that journey begins. They say grief makes time stop, but for him time never stopped. It simply lost its meaning. He was the last to leave the boardroom that afternoon. Still in his charcoal suit, black silk tie, shoulders straight as always. But if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen it, something different in his eyes. Not fatigue, not pressure, but the vacant gaze of a man who had lost something unrecoverable. He was the CEO of a leading tech empire, powerful, wealthy, admired. But when he checked into the familiar hotel that evening, his hand trembled. As he signed the guest form, he didn't notice it, but the receptionist did, and she bowed her head gently, said nothing. His room was on the top floor. The windows were wide, filled with the grey hush of late afternoon light, revealing everything in sharp, cold detail. The bed made to perfection, the armchair neatly placed beside the tea table, and a small vase of baby's breath in the corner. Her detail left by a housekeeper with a quiet kind of grace. He set down his suitcase. Didn't turn on the lights. There was no need. The light from outside was enough to see the room and to see that it held no life. Everything was pristine, precise, and utterly hollow. He removed his watch, loosened his tie, and sat at the edge of the bed. For a moment the world stopped. No traffic noise, no hum of vents, just the sound of his own breath, slow and heavy. In front of him was the walnut desk, and on it a note, small, folded once. No hotel logo, no stationery header. Just plain white paper, with slanted, slightly shaky handwriting, like someone had wrestled long with the decision to write it. He opened it. Hand read, "I don't know who you are, but I hope today is a little kinder to you, from someone who's been there." One line. That was all. But it was as if someone had laid a hand on his chest, soft, steady, and real. He didn't know why he stood, or why the tears came, but they did. Quietly, slowly, enough to dampen his sleeve. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks since his wife's death, he let himself collapse. Not as a CEO, not as the helpless husband behind the glass of the ICU room, but simply as a man, alone, unmoored, and gently touched by someone who had no name, but knew exactly where it hurt. He didn't know who had written it. Maybe the housekeeper. Maybe someone who had known Loska. Maybe no one had known him at all, but that was precisely what made it so sincere. No pity. No platitudes. Just one human reaching for another. He folded the note again, carefully, as if one wrong crease might erase what had just reached him. He placed it in his wallet, right next to the worn photo of his wife laughing, her purest smile. When night fell, he didn't turn on the TV. Didn't check his email, he just sat there, still alone. But unlike every other night, this time something softened inside him, not because the grief had lifted, but because for the first time he didn't feel like the only one carrying it. Outside, beyond the high-rise glass, the city lights blinked to life, tiny signals scattered like stars, quiet transmissions from the universe to a man on the verge. And he thought, if just one sentence could make me cry, then maybe, just maybe, there are still things worth staying for. That night, he didn't sleep, nor did he cry again. After those rare tears spilled for a note left by no one in particular, a strange kind of silence settled over him. Not the heavy stillness of nights past, but something else entirely. The quiet of a man who had finally touched the feeling he'd buried too deep for too long. He sat alone in the dark. Outside the tall window, the city moved. Cars drifted past, traffic lights changed their hues. But inside that room, high above it all, he began to remember, not numbers, not contracts, not keynote speeches, but the soft, breakable things he'd avoided. The way she used to place her hand over his when he fell silent. The scent of bergamot in her hair, each morning. And the way she used to say, "All I need is one person to really see me." The day she died, he hadn't cried in front of anyone. Standing before guests, partners, reporters, he was composed, nodding, thanking them for their condolences. But alone, in his office, he'd picked up the photo frame from his desk and shattered it, not from anger, but because the pain had become too much to carry. They say grief softens with time, but his didn't. It hardened, turned into something invisible, an ache that no one could see, no one could touch, and because no one saw it, he stopped pretending. That's why when he read the note, plain, brief, unsigned, he felt like he was finally allowed to breathe. No one told him to be strong, and no one said, "You'll be okay," just one line. "I hope today is a little kinder to you." From someone who's been there, that phrase pierced him like a quiet admission. "I know your pain. I've carried it too." And for someone who had stood at the intersection of success and deep private loneliness, what he needed wasn't a solution. He needed that. Compassion without explanation. He pulled out his phone, half ready to message an old friend, but stopped. He didn't know where to start. "I'm okay. I'm not okay, but I'm still here." The screen lit, then dimmed. He set it down. Instead, he stepped onto the balcony. The night air was soft, clean. He inhaled deeply, and for the first time in weeks, the scent of night didn't remind him of a hospital hallway. Below, the city moved on. People were still living. And he, though he didn't yet know what tomorrow would bring, was still here, in this moment, no longer wanting to disappear. By morning, he was still awake. No shower, no combed hair, but he no longer felt like a ghost. Before leaving the room, he glanced back at the desk where the note had been. The space was empty now, but he remembered every word, every tremble in that handwriting, and he thought, if one simple message could keep someone like him from giving up, maybe someone out there still needed something like it too. This story might find you in a quiet place deep within, or remind you of something you thought you'd forgotten. If it does, hold it close, because maybe, one day, you'll leave a note behind for someone who needs to be seen. That morning, as he checked out of the hotel, he lingered longer than usual by the desk. The note was gone, cleared away by housekeeping. But the words still echoed, perfectly intact, inside him, like a thin thread of smoke winding through. The layers of memory, not visible, not solid, but impossible to dismiss. On the way to the car, he paused and turned back toward the hotel lobby. There was a pull, quiet, persistent, not a storm, but a whisper that sounded like his own voice. "Find the person who wrote it." He returned to the front desk. His tone was composed as always, but his eyes betrayed something else, a hesitation, a quiet urgency he couldn't hide. "Room 2701 yesterday," he said. "Do you know who cleaned it?" The receptionist tapped her screen, scanned the schedule. A flicker passed through her eyes before she answered. That was Maya's shift. "Well, Maya, but she requested personal leave starting this morning. I'm not sure when she'll be back." Maya. A small name, one he'd never heard before. No face to go with it. And yet, it lodged itself in his mind immediately, as though if he didn't find the person behind it, he'd carry a question for the rest of his life. When he returned home, he didn't go to the office, didn't attend the meetings on his calendar. Instead, he sat down and wrote a letter. Not long, not formal. Just a few lines handwritten on plain white paper. The handwriting was uneven, slightly shaky, his fingers not used to pen and paper anymore, but every word came from some place honest. "I don't know who you are, but the note you left saved me in a way I never imagined. If you remember. That piece of paper, please let me say thank you. Signed, someone who didn't fall because of you." The next day, he returned to the hotel. No one recognized him as the CEO whose name floated through headlines. He took the elevator to the 27th floor, opened the door to room 2701, and placed the letter carefully on the desk, right where her note had once been. He closed the door and walked away, not expecting, but unable not to hope. A day passed. Then, too, Then a week, no response, no message, no mention of Maya. She had disappeared like mist after dawn, leaving behind only a single sentence that had shifted the direction of a life. He began staying at the hotel more often, different excuses each time, meetings, rest, quiet space. But the real reason never changed. He wanted to know if she would come back. Each time he entered the room, he scanned the small details, the way the towels were folded, the placement of the flower vase, even the scent of the room spray, searching for something, anything that might feel familiar, a trace of someone who had once seen his pain without needing to know his name. But everything stayed the same. The room was clean, neat, exactly as it should be. Only the warmth he remembered was missing. Still, he began to leave more notes, short ones, never asking, never pleading, just quiet acknowledgements. I still remember. I'm still grateful. No one ever replied. But he kept writing, not because he needed an answer, but because each time he put pen to paper, he felt like he was holding on to something soft and human within himself, something he had thought was lost forever. Maybe the ache wasn't really about not finding her. Maybe what haunted him most was the realization that he had once believed he needed no one, until a complete stranger, with one anonymous line, taught him that human connection doesn't come through logic, it comes through feeling, and feeling sometimes arrives from the most unexpected places. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for anymore. The handwritten notes he kept leaving behind seemed to vanish into thin air, no reply, no trace. And yet, each time he unlocked the door to room 2701, his eyes flicked instinctively to the corner of the desk where that single folded note had once rested, with the faint aching hope that maybe, just maybe, a forgotten dream might find its way back. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Light rain drizzled against the city's glass. Bones. He returned to the hotel but didn't book a room. This time he walked straight to the front desk and asked to see the manager, a middle-aged man he'd spoken to once or twice before. I have a rather strange request, he began, voice calm, polite, but threaded with something quieter. More urgent. I'd like to review the security footage from the 27th floor about 3 weeks ago. The manager hesitated, narrowing his eyes slightly. May I ask why, sir? It's not a security concern, he said. I'm looking for someone. A relative? No, he answered, softer now. A housekeeping staff member. I don't know her name. Only that she left me a note. He paused, eyes dropping for just a second. A note that saved me. Silence settled between them. Then the manager nodded, slowly. Maybe he saw it too. That look in his eyes. The one that can't be faked. Hours later, they sat in the small security office, the hum of machines loud against the hush. A black and white recording flickered to life. The hallway of the 27th floor, the timestamp hovering in the corner. And there she was. She stepped out of room 2701, dressed in the hotel uniform, hair tied neatly back. Her pace was brisk, but unhurried. In one hand, a folded towel. But it was the moment she paused, leaned ever so slightly over the desk, placed something down, and lingered just a second longer than necessary, that stopped his breath. She looked around, quick, almost shy. Then she turned and walked toward the elevator. The camera caught only part of her face, the curve of a cheek, the line of a jaw. But there was something unmistakable in the way she moved. In that brief moment of hesitation, it was her. What's her name? He asked, already knowing. Maya, the manager replied. Quiet, kind. Been with us almost 5 years. Kept to herself. But recently, she requested a leave. Permanently? No. Just temporary. Personal reasons. She didn't say much. He stared at the screen a moment longer, as if willing the image to move again, as if she might turn, smile, speak. But the frame froze. She disappeared behind the closing elevator doors, like a quiet comma at the end of a sentence he wasn't ready to finish. He left the office with the note clutched in his hand, creased and worn now, the paper soft from the times he'd unfolded and read it. He didn't speak. Just nodded, thanked the manager and walked out. The hotel corridor felt oddly still that day, and for the first time since he had read her words, he found himself face to face with something he thought he'd buried long ago. The shape of loss, but this time it wasn't a final kind of loss. It was the quiet ache of something unresolved, an emptiness that didn't close a door, just left it slightly ajar. And what haunted him most wasn't that he hadn't met her. It was not knowing if she knew that the few words she had written had done far more than she could ever have imagined. He had stopped searching, not because he'd given up, but because he was tired. 3 weeks had passed since he'd watched that old security tape, since he'd seen her image flicker across the screen like a spark snuffed out too quickly. Every effort after that had led him back to the same beginning, a name, a silhouette, and nothing more. Maya, short, no last name, no address. No phone number, no digital footprint. She seemed like someone who didn't quite belong to this place, who existed just long enough to leave a silence in someone else's heart, then disappeared as if she had never been here at all. Work resumed, but this time he wasn't hiding behind meetings or spreadsheets. He started fulfilling the unfinished dreams of his late wife, her list of projects, scribbled in the margins of notebooks, tucked into drawers like quiet hopes. The first was a book donation drive at a small community center north of the city. No flash photography, no press release, just people bringing old books, stacking them on folding tables and sharing warm cookies between shy conversations. That morning he arrived early. Maybe it was nerves, maybe insomnia, or maybe deep down he was waiting for something. Unnamed. The center's courtyard was already alive with soft commotion. Boxes of books lined the fence. Children ran past. Adults chatted in low tones, laughter rising like steam into the early sunlight. The air smelled of sugar and sun-warmed concrete. Music drifted from a small speaker perched on a bench. And, then like a frame from a film without sound, he saw her, no lightning, no cinematic glow, just a slender figure, sleeves rolled up, white shirt rumpled at the elbows, hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck, crouched to tighten the string on a box. He stopped mid-step. Everything around him dulled to a distant not because he was certain it was only her profile from that angle, but he knew, the kind of knowing that doesn't come from memory, but from the place in you that had once been seen. I hope today is a little kinder to you. She didn't know he was watching. She was busy, sorting books, clearing scraps of tape, portioning sandwiches into paper bags, not calling attention to herself, not demanding space. She was the kind of person people overlooked in a crowd. Quiet, steady, nearly invisible. But to him, she was the reason he still stood here, still breathing, still believing that kindness hadn't vanished from the world. He didn't approach. His feet stayed rooted, while his mind spiraled into a single, hesitant thought. What if I go to her? What if she doesn't remember? What if she doesn't want to? So instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper, borrowed a pen from a volunteer nearby. His hand trembled a little, like it had the last time he wrote something by hand. You saved someone without knowing. No. Tamed, no invitation, no expectation. He folded it neatly, watched her carry another box inside, then stepped toward her table, tucked the note gently between two books, not obvious, but not hidden. As he turned away, she came back out. Their paths didn't cross, but in that split second, her eyes passed over the back of his jacket. Maybe she noticed. Maybe she didn't, but something shifted in the air. Something small like breath held between two people who never speak. He didn't stay, didn't linger to see if she found it. That afternoon, when the event was over, she stayed behind. To clean, the sun was low, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. She sorted the last of the books, slid a heavy cover into a box, and then she saw it. At first, she thought it was just scrap paper, but when she unfolded it and read the single line, she went still. Not long. Not poetic, but her throat tightened. Her eyes stung. There was no signature, but the handwriting, slightly rushed, earnest, was unmistakable in its honesty. She held the note for a long time, then pressed it gently to her chest. No. One around her knew what had just passed through the air, but she knew. She didn't know exactly who, but she understood. Someone out there had carried what she left behind farther than she ever imagined. And in that moment, all the weariness of the past few weeks melted quietly into the air. Something softened inside her, like a whisper, like a sunbeam catching her shoulder through the branches. She couldn't sleep that night. The note stayed folded in the pocket of her shirt, hanging quietly on the hook by the door. She tucked it away carefully, as though it was something precious, though it was only a few words long. But those words had made her see her life differently, as if, for the first time, she was allowed to believe it mattered. She returned to the community center the next morning, not for duty, not for work. She came because something inside her hadn't settled. The note was still with her. Its creases softened from the night she'd held it in her hand while lying awake. You saved someone without knowing, and when she stepped into the courtyard, she saw him. No longer just a figure passing through a crowd, no longer the man in a suit who left behind something unfinished. He sat on a bench beneath the old tree, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on hers, as if he'd been waiting a very long time. They didn't smile, didn't nod. She walked toward him, slowly, carefully, like someone about to cross, into sacred ground, where things might begin or end, and no one had yet spoken the words aloud. "Was it you?" "Fa," she asked, her voice steady but thin with feeling. He nodded, didn't look away, then gestured to the space beside him. "Would you like to sit?" The word "you" came out as M, unthinking. As if, during all the weeks he'd written, letters to no one, he'd already learned to call her that. Something tender, something close. She sat, a hand's width apart, and hundreds of unspoken questions between them. For a while, there was only wind and breath. She kept her hands in her lap. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn square of paper, the first note, the edges curled, one corner torn, but the handwriting still perfectly intact. He unfolded it, laid it between them like a quiet artifact. "I've carried it with me since that day," he said. She stared at it, stilled. She didn't know what to feel. Pride, surprise, or the strange fear of knowing something she wrote in passing had carried so much unexpected weight. Then he spoke again, and this time his voice cracked, the voice of someone who wasn't a CEO or a man with power and control, but someone who had lost, someone who had almost let go. "My wife died 2 months ago. It was a normal morning." And then it was silence. He stopped. She looked down at his hand, tendons tight, fingers shaking slightly. "I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't ask why. I just stopped." He pointed at the paper. "Until I read this." It wasn't advice. It didn't pretend to understand me. It just was there. Soft. Honest. She listened, each word sinking into her like stones into water, creating ripples that reached the places she thought she'd closed off. "I wrote that after a sleepless night," she whispered. "I kept thinking about someone I didn't know who might be hurting, because once you've known a certain kind of pain, you never forget what it looks like." He turned to her then, and for the first time, they really saw each other, not as strangers, not as questions, but as people who had stood at the edge and somehow hadn't fallen. "You didn't think it would go that far?" he asked gently. "I didn't even think anyone would read it." They both laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because admitting how strange and beautiful it all was left no other choice. After a pause, he said, "I used to think a successful man shouldn't be fragile, shouldn't hold on to a piece of paper just to keep going. But now I think," he added, "maybe what saves us isn't logic, it's timing." She lowered her gaze, then murmured, I used to think I was invisible. I never went to college and no one remembers my name. I just cleaned messes, picked up what others dropped, stayed silent. But if what I wrote helped someone— Stay, she said, eyes bright with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Then maybe I'm not as invisible as I thought. He looked at her for a long time, not with pity, but with something deeper, a quiet reverence. As if he understood at last that quiet people, the ones who carry kindness like a secret, deserve to stand beside all the grand things we praise. You didn't save me, he said. You're not a doctor, you're not a therapist, but you made me stay. The wind stilled. A leaf fell so softly it barely made a sound, but inside both of them something clicked open, like light finally slipping through a door that had been shut too long. If you could go back to that day, she asked suddenly, voice low, what would you want to hear besides the words I wrote? He was quiet for a moment, then said, nothing else, just that someone saw me, even when I didn't know I was still here. The truth of it hit her like a hush. They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, didn't promise to see each other again, but they stood side by side and walked out of that courtyard like two people who had completed a journey without ever needing a map, only the quiet grace of being heard. Have you ever left something small for a stranger, or been saved by someone who never knew how deeply they touched you? Maybe your words, too, could be the reason someone chooses to stay. After that day in the courtyard, they didn't keep in touch, not immediately. No exchanged numbers, no promises, not even a polite, let's stay in touch. But both of them knew. Something had shifted. For her, the change arrived. Quietly the next morning, in the way she looked at herself in the mirror. It was no longer the familiar, weary face she'd seen after long shifts cleaning hotel rooms, no longer the eyes that instinctively avoided others. That day, for the first time in years, she looked herself straight in the eye and didn't feel like a stranger. For him, the change didn't come in one moment, but as a slow rising tide. After he left the community center, he walked slower, quieter, not heavy with grief, but filled with the kind of silence that comes when something new is about to begin. Few days later, they met again, not by chance. This time it was a meeting by choice, a small cafe tucked beneath an oak tree, where the late afternoon sun slanted through the glass, casting golden streaks across the table like light you could almost touch. He arrived early, and when she walked in, he stood up, not from habit, not from politeness, but because she was someone who had redefined what kindness meant to him. After a few gentle greetings, he began, I'm rebuilding a charity fund. In my wife's name. She'd wanted to start it for a long time. But she passed before she could. She didn't speak, just nodded. The kind of nod that told him she was listening with more than just her ears. I want to invite you to work with us, he said. Not out of gratitude. Not out of sentiment, but because I believe you can help people the way you helped me. She froze. That sentence struck a place deep within her, the place where she had long doubted her worth, her place in the world. I've never done anything important, she said quietly. I was just someone who cleaned rooms, who left a few scribbled lines. I don't know if I'm enough for something like this. You are, he said, gently, but with a quiet finality. You are, because you saw pain and didn't look away, because you know that silence is strength, not weakness. She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window where a small boy was wobbling on a tricycle while his mother cheered from a distance. The scene was ordinary, but it made her smile. If I say yes, she said softly, I want to work in the letter-writing project, writing to people in hospitals, in shelters, to anyone who feels invisible, because I believe if a word is written at the right moment, it can do what I did for you without even knowing it. He smiled then, a rare smile, gentle and certain. He pulled a stack of blank paper and a pen from his briefcase, as if he had known all along what her answer would be. Then let's begin today. She took the paper. Her hands still trembled, but not from fear this time. She understood. The pages before her weren't just blank. They were a beginning, not as a cleaner, but as someone who sowed kindness with words. A week later, she had her first desk, in a small office at the Foundations branch, no nameplate, no business cards, but there was a jar of fresh flowers, sunlight through sheer curtains, and a drawer filled with stationery. Every day, she wrote 3 letters. No one asked her to, no one checked, but each word came from somewhere real, as if she was sitting across from the person reading, whispering, "I don't know who you are, but I hope today is a little kinder to you." As for him, he didn't interfere. He walked past her office each morning, only nodding hello. In his eyes was the quiet trust of someone who knew she was doing something no one else could do, sending out small, fragile things into the world that might just be strong enough to help someone stay one more day. Her small office sat on the second floor of an old building, its balcony overlooking a tree-lined street that rustled with morning light. Every day she arrived with the same ritual: a warm cup of tea, a stack of blank paper, and a weathered letterbox. Inside it were the notes she wrote, simple, heartfelt lines sent to hospitals, community centers, nursing homes, and sometimes to hotel rooms where no one expected anything personal to be waiting. No one assigned her this task. There were no deadlines, no contracts, no metrics to meet, but each stroke of her pen, each word carefully chosen, carried a quiet reverence, because she knew sometimes all it takes is one sentence, given at the right time, to the right heart, to make someone stay. I know today might feel heavy, but if you've made it this far, you still have a little farther to go. You're not the only one who feels this way. It's just that no one has said it yet. I don't know you, but I believe you deserve a peaceful morning. She never signed them, only left a single line at the bottom, from someone who's been there. Each letter was folded neatly into a plain white envelope. Some of them were sent to hotels that had agreed to become part of the Foundation's Emotional Rest Stops initiative. There, guests, from CEOs and tourists to people in transition, would sometimes open a drawer or find a slip of paper resting on a pillow. No one knew who had written them, but some wrote back, quiet responses sent to a discreet return address. Every week a few found their way back to her desk. "I just got divorced, couldn't sleep my first night alone. That letter made me cry. And then I breathed a little easier. My daughter took her own life last week. I haven't been able to tell anyone, but your note made me feel not entirely invisible." She read them, folded them, back up, not to display, not to collect, just to remind herself that the smallest things can travel farther than we ever imagine. As for him, he still kept that first note in his wallet. Faded now, corners worn, ink a little smudged, but he never replaced it, never flattened it or printed a new copy, because every crease, every mark, held the weight of the journey it had helped him survive. Sometimes he still visited the community center, not to lead, not to manage, just to listen. One day he passed a woman reading a note left on the table. She folded it gently and slipped it into her pocket. He didn't say a word, didn't tell her who wrote it, just smiled and walked on. Because now it no longer mattered who had begun the thread. What mattered was that the words kept traveling, kept landing where they were needed, kept being read by hearts that were ready. One evening, after she'd finished tidying her desk, he came by with a small wooden box. "I found this in our old storage," he said. My wife meant to use it for collecting letters from clients. She never got the chance to start." She opened the box. Inside were unused sheets of stationery, a few handwritten notes in the margins, drafts, half-thoughts, but they slowed the room, softened the air. "I think," she said softly, "I can carry that forward." He nodded. She'd really like that. That night, in a small coastal hotel far from the city, a middle-aged man opened the nightstand drawer. Between the guest directory and the safety instructions, he found a folded note, white paper, simple, quiet. He read it, then sat for a long time unmoving. No one knew his name. No one knew that he had been planning to call his lawyer that night to end everything, but he didn't. Because of that note, he chose to stay. One more person, still here. Thank You for staying with this story until the very last line. If it touched something in you, hold it gently, like a message you once needed to hear. And if you believe in the quiet power of kindness, join us. Subscribe to hear more stories that heal. From all of us, thank you for walking quietly with us all the way here. The shy girl gently handed over her last $10 bill to a man she believed was homeless, never knowing he was a millionaire testing the hearts of strangers. And that quiet act of kindness changed everything. Because sometimes a silent gesture of goodness was destiny's first gentle knock. The wind cut through the city like a blade. Clouds drifted low over the grimy rooftops at the end of the street, as if the sky itself had sagged under the same weight pressing on the human heart. On a cracked sidewalk amid the rush of footsteps and the ceaseless wail of car horns, Serafina stood still, like a small comma in the endless sentence of a city that never paused. She clutched a $10 bill in her hand, her last. Not because it was worth much, but because it was her one ticket to a proper meal before the week ran dry. A discounted loaf of bread, maybe still warm if she made it to the shop before it closed. But Serafina hadn't moved. She stood frozen, as though her feet were pinned in place by a hesitation she couldn't quite name. Across the street, a man sat curled on the cold pavement, gaunt, wrapped in a threadbare coat, each coughing fit bent his body like a tree. In the wind. He didn't hold out a hand, didn't call out. No cardboard sign, no plea. Just sat there, as if he'd long since made peace with being overlooked. People passed. No one stopped. But Serafina couldn't take her eyes off him. It wasn't a look of desperation he carried, nor one of resignation. It was a quiet, hollow, but laced with something almost dignified. Each time someone walked by, he gave a small nod. No words, no begging, just a gesture, simple as a period at the end of a sentence. Pride, wrapped in a body worn thin, the wind slipped through Serafina's coat collar, stinging her skin. She shivered, partly from cold, mostly from something stirring inside her chest. She looked down at the bill, then turned toward the store window beside her. In the glass, she saw a girl with sunken cheeks, sleepless eyes, a wrinkled, old coat, and lips pressed tight against the threat of tears. That girl, she had little, but she still had a choice. Just one breath, one step. Serafina crossed the street. Quietly, no more thinking. She didn't speak. Didn't ask. She simply placed the $10 bill into the man's hand. His fingers were ice-cold, soft and dry. His eyes blinked, as if he'd heard a sound that couldn't be heard. Before he could say anything, she turned, walked fast, nearly running, afraid. She might change her mind, or that the feeling rising in her throat might spill out in sobs. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen. The man didn't unfold the bill, didn't get up. He only smiled. A quiet smile, not sad but knowing. As if he had expected this all along. And then among the stream of passers-by, they became one walking away, one remaining, utterly changed, because of one small moment. And sometimes the smallest moments are where the biggest things begin. Back home, the wind still clung to the back of Serafina's neck, as if it had followed her the entire way. Her fingers had gone stiff inside their thin gloves, but she didn't go in right away. She stood before the peeling door, inhaling deeply. The damp wood and dust-laced hallway smelled of transience, like everything here was waiting to be replaced. Even hope. Her small room sat tucked inside a crumbling building on the city's edge. Just enough space for a narrow bed, a rickety table, and a mini-fridge that had given up last winter. The silence here was familiar. Not the comforting kind, but the kind that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The door clicked shut behind her, with a sound louder than it should have been. Serafina dropped her bag without turning on the light. The glow of the street lamp outside cut through the dirty window pane, casting a slanted beam across the table, where a single white envelope lay waiting. She didn't have to open it. The third rent notice this month. 3 bold lines, hammering the same old bruise. She opened her wallet. A few coins rolled out, clinking across the table like pebbles into a dry stream. She counted them by habit, though she knew they wouldn't even buy a cheap cup of tea from the corner shop, and she wasn't going out anyway. Tucked beneath the coins, like a memory lying still, was a torn photograph. Mother and daughter standing side by side in the light of a day long gone. The tear split right through her mother's face. Serafina had kept it that way for years, not to forget, but to remember that some questions don't need answers. Behind the photo was a handkerchief, the fabric worn thin, the pale blue, stitching faded, but still carrying the faint scent of mint, what her mother used when she was sick as a child. Serafina pressed it gently to her cheek, like she could will peace back into herself. "If it were you," she whispered, eyes tracing the cracked tiles on the ceiling, "you would have kept that money, wouldn't you?" No reply came, only a faint crack somewhere in the wall, the house exhaling softly, as if it knew all too well the kind of people who always chose right and got nothing in return. Tears came, quiet and unremarkable. No sobbing, no collapse, just the slow melt of a long frozen surface. In that moment she didn't regret what she'd done, but she wasn't sure it had been right either. Something unnamed simmered inside her, not sorrow, not hope. Exactly. A strange in-between place where exhaustion and longing lived side by side. The kind of place where a person wonders, am I surviving, or just prolonging something that should have ended? Outside the window, snow had begun to faulty, the season's first flakes, soft, slow. They drifted like they didn't want to disturb anyone. And Serafina, like the snow, wanted only to exist quietly. Until something else began, she only asked for a chance to start over. But the past had a way of resurfacing like a stain that wouldn't wash out. If it were you, when the world won't let you move past an old mistake, would you walk away in silence or stand and reclaim your worth? Tell your story. Maybe yours is the one that helps someone keep going. The snow had stopped by morning, but the cold clung on, silent and thin as a film of frost that couldn't be brushed away. Serafina layered on a worn grey sweater, tied her hair back neatly, and slipped into the scuffed black shoes she'd kept like a quiet fragment of hope, as if looking put together might mean someone would finally listen. She arrived at the city library early. The space was still closed to the public, lit only by a dim amber glow. The silence inside felt suspended, like breath held just beneath the surface. She waited, still as a newly frozen lake, flat but far from calm. Her breath curled in wisps as she touched the button of her coat, fastening what little remained of her fragile composure. The manager emerged from the hallway, a tall woman, about 50, sharp eyes, beige coat, name tag pinned just so. She looked at Serafina the way one might glance at an unscheduled task on an already full agenda. "Good morning," she said without smiling, already flipping through the file. "I've reviewed your application. It says here you studied literature." Serafina nodded, voice soft. "I did. Almost finished. But I had to leave before my final year because—" She trailed off. Not because she didn't have a reason, just one that had long stopped earning sympathy. The manager didn't look up, her hands still moving through the pages. "Family reasons," she said with a pause that wasn't mocking, but wasn't warm either. "Unfortunately, we need someone who can commit to full shifts. No sudden absences, no interruptions." Serafina tightened her lips. Her spine stretched taut like a violin string, trying not to let the memory of that morning, when her mother walked out and didn't come back, flood in like cold water. "I'm steady now. I can work. Really work," she said, her voice almost pleading, though she kept her tone even. This time the manager looked up, met her gaze, for a breath, then gently shook her head as if brushing away a speck of dust from the table. "You seem pitiful," she said, "but pity doesn't keep this library running. We need consistency. Thank you for coming in." No anger, no harsh dismissal, just a soft tone that made Serafina feel like a leaf flicked off a stone. She didn't argue, didn't ask for another chance. She only nodded, quietly like she'd practiced that gesture her whole life, and turned away. As she stepped outside, the manager's voice drifted after her, low but just loud enough to find its way into the hollow behind her ear. They always think kindness is enough, but kindness doesn't pay the bills. Serafina walked faster, breath tight in her throat, as if even the air had decided it didn't want to follow her today. She didn't cry. She just felt like a room without light. Everything still there but unseen. A sparrow landed on the step ahead of her, its eyes dark and bright. For a second, it stayed. Then it flew. Serafina watched it go, exhaling slowly. No one ever tells you that the first step toward trying again can hurt more than surrender. But she stood there just a few moments longer, long enough to gather the thought that, if this world has no place for the ones who've stumbled, then who will be left to rebuild the road? The small park sat on the edge of the city, where yellow street lamps cast their dim light over brittle grass and weathered green benches with peeling paint. Life here moved a few beats slower. People came to read, to escape the clamor of markets and sidewalks, or simply to sit quietly, as if this place more than any other allowed them to do so without having to explain why. Serafina chose the last bench, the one farthest from the path, under the weakest light. Night had fallen, not fully but enough to soften every edge. She drew her coat tighter around her, fingers curled around the frayed handkerchief, the last thing that still held some trace of her mother. The bond between them had long since unraveled beyond anything called love, but not far enough to escape the ache of absence. She'd been sitting for a while. She hadn't counted the minutes. The lake in front of her was still, mirroring a faint, washed-out moon, just like her own reflection in this moment, no longer sad enough to cry, not yet calm enough to call it peace. Laughter rang out from the path to her right, a child's voice, light and sudden. A little girl, no more than 6, came skipping past, clutching a red heart-shaped balloon. She darted by Serafina, then halted, as if something tugged at her memory. At that exact moment, a breeze swept through, lifting the string from her hand. The balloon danced upward, drifting toward the tall oak tree. Serafina didn't think. She just moved. As if by instinct, she stood and ran, catching the string just before the balloon floated out of reach. When she turned back, the girl stood a few steps away, watching, not with excitement but with something deeper, a kind of quiet wonder, as though she was seeing not the balloon but something else, something adults had long stopped noticing. Serafina knelt and handed the balloon back. Her hands trembled, but the girl's smile settled something inside her. "You're really nice," the girl said softly, her voice so earnest it made the air still. "My mom says, nice people get magic." Serafina paused. That one line, simple, childlike, felt like it opened a long-forgotten door inside her. A place where belief had once lived, now dust-covered from being left untouched for too long. The girl's mother came running, out of breath. She bowed a quick thank you, took her daughter's hand, and hurried off, leaving Serafina alone again beneath the oak. The wind picked up, colder now, but it didn't make her flinch anymore. She sat back down, slowly unfolded the old handkerchief, and traced the loose threads with her thumb. Inside her, no clear answer. Just a quiet shift, like the way winter stills the wind for a minute, long enough to make you believe spring might be coming. A tear slid down the back of her hand. It wasn't from pain, just the kind of tear that comes when someone finally sees you as you are, not out of pity, not because you asked, just because they looked and they saw. She stayed there as night deepened, as if she needed more time to understand what had just passed through her. Not a miracle, but maybe a reminder that even when you've lost your faith in grown-ups, kindness is still visible in the clear, unfiltered eyes of a child. By the time Serafina left the park, night had fully arrived. The rows of streetlights stretched quietly with her steps, as if the light itself had chosen to walk beside someone who wasn't entirely sure where she was going. When she opened the door to her room, everything was as she had left it, still worn, steeped in the faint dampness and invisible dust of passing time. She didn't turn on the light. The darkness felt like a silent companion, sometimes more comforting than the questions that never came with answers. She placed the handkerchief on the table and sat at the edge of her bed, ready to curl into herself and let the hunger pass, as she so often did. But then a sound, barely a sound at all, 3 knocks, soft, even. She froze. No one ever came to this room at this hour. No one knew she lived here, except the landlord, and he only knocked when rent was due. Serafina stepped into the hallway. No one. Just the muted yellow glow on the faded tiles and a craft paper envelope lying neatly at her doorstep. She looked around once more. Still no one. No retreating footsteps. No elevator doors. Only the thin whistle of wind. Slipping through the unrepaired window panes, she bent to pick it up. Her hands were cold, but the envelope was strangely warm, as if it had just been tucked from someone's chest, still holding breath and something else entirely. Inside, a piece of deep yellow paper, handwritten, neat and slanted. I don't forget those who still know how to pause. If you still believe in that, come to this address. 9 tomorrow. No name, no explanation. Serafina held her breath. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but from something beginning to stir, something unfamiliar yet not unknown. She read the line again, as if afraid she wouldn't have another chance to memorize it. Then something slid from the envelope's bottom. The handkerchief. Her mother's handkerchief. The one she thought she'd lost long ago, maybe in a moment of fatigue, or maybe just from getting used to things slipping away. She picked it up. The fabric was still soft, the pale blue embroidery still quietly resting at the hem. But now there was something new. A fine white stitch in the lower left corner. A quiet mark, as if someone had held it, cared for it, and returned it. At the very moment she needed it most, Serafina sat down, not speaking. She stared at the cloth for a long time, as though trying to trace the journey it had taken, the hands that had held it, the eyes that had seen it. A question rose in her chest, clear but unhurried. Who saw me closely enough to know what? This handkerchief meant. Outside the window, the wind changed direction. The row of dark houses remained, but the night sky seemed a little brighter, even without a moon. She pressed the cloth into her palm, then placed it gently on the table. She didn't know if this was a joke. She didn't know what waited for her tomorrow, but for the first time in years she didn't need to understand it all right away. It simply felt right. Tomorrow morning, she would go, not out of hope, but because the handkerchief had returned, and with it a small piece of faith had come back too. The next morning, the city wore a film of pale mist, wrapping everything, the hum of traffic, the rhythm of footsteps, even the morning light, in a temporary hush. Serafina stepped off the number 42 bus, holding the slip of paper with the address, scanning her surroundings as she walked. There it was, the Elm Foundation, etched into a weathered wooden sign fixed to the front of a faded 3-story red brick building. The facade bore the wear of time, but the polished glass and well-tended doorway suggested care, like a house that had once fallen apart but had learned how to stand again. Serafina paused before entering, her hand resting on the door for a beat too long. Inside, everything shifted. The space was filled with soft daylight, beige walls and hand-painted art lining the hallway. A young woman greeted her with a warm, unintrusive smile, said nothing unnecessary, and gently led her to a small room at the very end. "Mr. Wren is expecting you," she said quietly before leaving her alone. Serafina stepped inside. The room was simple, a wide wooden desk, 2 grey upholstered chairs, and a tall window looking out at a row of bare maple trees. Seated across from the light was a man in a dark brown sweater, lean frame and unmistakable eyes. The same eyes, hollow yet dignified, that she had seen on the street corner. Only now they were different, awake, clear, fully present. She froze, partly from recognition, mostly from not understanding how the invisible threads of her life had led her here. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and warm, like wind brushing against an open window. "I'm Tobias Wren," she swallowed. "You're the man from that day?" He nodded. "You look surprised. You're not homeless?" The question slipped out, clumsy with confusion. "No," he said calmly. "I was testing something I've always believed, that kindness doesn't depend on circumstance, and you, Serafina, proved that." She sat slowly, her hands curling into themselves in her lap. "Why me?" she asked, so softly she barely heard herself. Tobias reached for a thin folder and slid it across the desk. "Because you had nothing and still chose to give." She looked down. The heading read, "One Act, One Life Community Project." "We're looking for someone to lead this," he said. "Not an expert, not someone with a polished resume. We need someone who's been on the other side. Someone who knows what it's like to not be seen, to not be believed. I think that person is you." She looked up at him, eyes wide and unblinking. A strange sensation bloomed in her chest, like lost memories returning not to wound, but to remind her that they had happened. He leaned back slightly. "But before I hand you a contract, I want to ask you one thing." His gaze met hers, steady. "Do you believe you deserve to be helped?" The question landed like a mirror held up without warning. She had no ready answer. All her life she'd only known how to endure. Not to ask, not to hope, not to believe anyone would ever stop for her. She lowered her eyes, then slowly shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't think I do." A long pause passed between them. Then she looked up. "But I didn't do it expecting anything in return." Her voice was firmer now, quiet but grounded. Tobias smiled, not in triumph, but with the calm of someone hearing exactly what they'd waited for. He opened the folder, picked up a pen. "Then this is your first chance where you don't have to prove anything. Just begin again, as you are." Serafina reached for the pen. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the fragile wonder of someone who has stepped out of the cold and touched warmth for the first time in years. A tear slipped down her cheek, not from pain, but because, for the first time in her life, she didn't have to be strong to be seen. A week later, in the community room at the Elm Foundation, the pale light of early winter filtered through tall windows, laying a soft glow across the wooden floors and the circle of folding chairs. There was no podium, no microphone, no separation between speaker and listener. Just people, people who had lost things, who had once faded from the margins of society, now learning how to see one another again through the fragile honesty of small stories. Serafina stood by the tea table, her fingers resting on a warm ceramic cup, watching as the room slowly filled with hesitant footsteps and flickering eyes. She had been there once, afraid of sound, wary of looks, convinced her words held no weight in any silence. She didn't make a speech. There was no need. She simply smiled, nodding gently at each person who entered, as if quietly saying, "I know. I've been there." The circle began. A few stories surfaced. A middle-aged man spoke about the first time he dared to step into a bookstore after 2 years living in a tent. A young mother broke down, recalling New Year's Eve, when she hadn't had enough money to buy a loaf of bread for her daughter. And then a girl, maybe in her early 20s, sat slightly apart from the circle. Baggy coat, red-rimmed eyes. She raised a trembling hand. "I lost my place after the pandemic," she said, her voice cracking. "It wasn't really a home, just a rented room. But it was a place I could sleep without fearing someone would knock." She paused, swallowed. "I've been sleeping on a park bench the past few nights, and I don't know how many more breaths I have left in me to keep going." For a moment, the room held its breath. Every shuffle stilled. Every sound vanished into quiet. Serafina moved slowly. She didn't speak right away. She sat beside the girl, not too close and just near enough. She didn't offer comfort. She knew better. Sometimes even a light touch can feel heavier than a promise. From her coat pocket, she pulled out a handkerchief. The old one, edges frayed, once her mother's, once her own lifeline on long, cold nights, once returned to her as if by magic. She didn't look at the girl with knowing. She looked with recognition, like someone who had once sat in the very same seat. Then she placed the handkerchief gently into her hands. "You can keep it for a while," Serafina whispered, just loud enough. "It stayed with me during the nights I thought I couldn't go on. It doesn't have magic, but it reminded me that something, however small, was still enough to hold on to." The girl's hands shook. She gripped the cloth and the tears came freely. Around the circle, some lowered their heads. Someone exhaled deeply, like letting go of a weight long carried. No more words were needed. Serafina didn't ask for the handkerchief back when the session ended. She didn't count the days until it returned, because it no longer belonged to memory. It had become a thread, a quiet tether between those who had once lost their roots. Her proof that kindness once given doesn't vanish. It simply takes on new form and continues. And in Serafina's eyes now, there was no waiting, only light, the kind of light that lives in someone who has made it through the dark and now holds the door open for someone else to step into the morning. Night fell quietly, like a long arm of memory draping gently over the shoulders of the woman seated at her desk. Outside the window, the city had gone to sleep earlier than usual. Or maybe Serafina no longer looked for its movements the way she used to. She was writing. The light from her desk lamp cast a soft halo over the page, illuminating her slanted handwriting, steady, unhurried, like long measured breaths distilled into words. She didn't write every day, but when she did, it was as if she was sending something to someone who would never read it, but who still deserved to know. "I used to think," she began, "if my mother hadn't left, I would have been different." The pen paused, waiting for the thought to catch up, then continued, "But maybe because she did. I learned how to hold on to the best parts of the world, even when no one gave them to me first." She stopped. Her eyes lingered on the last line. There were no tears, no tightness in her throat, only a quiet that went deep, like standing in an old, emptied room where every memory had been cleared away, but the scent of wood, of time, of having once been there, still lingered. She closed the journal, placed it gently atop the old handkerchief, now washed clean, carrying the scent of fresh cotton, yet still bearing the faded stitching. Once her mother's, once hers. Now part of something larger, the quiet, revolving rhythm of kindness. The photo on the desk caught a flicker of the lamp's glow. In it, Serafina stood with Tobias and the team at a recent fundraiser. Beside them, a little girl with wild curls and the biggest smile, eyes lit like the first morning after days of rain. Serafina looked at the photo for a long time, then exhaled. Not the sigh of someone worn down, but of someone who had come far enough to understand. Some journeys don't begin with a reason, only with one person brave enough to take the first step. She rose and turned off the light. The room dimmed, but the computer screen still glowed, and on it the final line of her journal entry remained, clear like a quiet anthem that needed no applause. Kindness doesn't wait for conditions. It begins with one person, one time, just when it's needed. There was no soundtrack, no swelling strings, just a small room and a young woman who had finally learned to believe in herself, not through triumph, but by looking back and not flinching. Outside, the cold lingered, but somewhere perhaps someone had stopped, bent down to help a stranger, not for praise, not for reward, but because someone once did the same for them. One small act can reach across an entire life, just like the day Serafina chose kindness when she had nothing left to hold.